Good day, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture of week 3, or in my slides, sometimes it will appear as week 5, but it's actually week 3, letter B, or refining your works cited. This week is a turning point, or this lecture is a turning point in your writing process. Because now we shift from just writing to writing responsibly. Allow me to share my slides. When we talk about refining your work cited, we're not simply checking citation formats or reference styles. We are looking also at who you cite, why you cite them, and how those choices shape your scholarship. Citations are more than academic housekeeping. They're a reflection of your intellectual community, the people and ideas you decide to amplify through your work. And as we'll see, refining your work cited is both an ethical and scholarly act. Throughout the week, uh, these are the tasks you will be asked to do. I'm closing my video. I hope that's okay. So we'll move through 4 key steps. First, you'll assess your citation values, meaning you'll take a closer look at who's represented in your citations and who is not. Second, you'll identify additional works, filling in any gaps or blind spots in your current literature review. Third, you'll find your entry point, figuring out exactly where your work fits into the larger conversation. And finally, you'll write your review, building a compelling, inclusive literature review that showcases your unique contribution. By the end of the week, you'll not only have a stronger work cited, you'll also have a clearer sense of scholarly identity. So let's look at citation. No? Citation is an act of inclusion. Historically, academia has not been a level playing field. Certain voices, especially women, people of color, indigenous people, early career scholars, and researchers from the global south have been underrepresented in citations. So when we cite inclusively, we're doing more than being politically correct. We're actively reshaping the conversation to make it more equitable. We're saying all good scholarship deserves to be heard, not just the work from the same few names we always see. And this isn't about lowering standards, it's about widening the lens. When you diversify your citations, you enrich your own argument by including different perspectives, different methods, and different ways of seeing the world. let's look at understanding the citation values form. Now, how do we make these intentional rather than accidental? We use tools, and a beautiful tool is Belcher's citation values form, which can be downloaded from Belcher's site. But if we don't have the form, then we can look at it another way. Think of it as a mirror for your bibliography. It helps you track representation across multiple dimensions of gender, race, nationality, and even career stage. You can set your own goals, like 50% women authors, or at least two scholars from the Global South. Remember, the Philippines belong to the Global South. It's not about hitting a perfect quota, it's about awareness. When you see your citations broken down this way, you start to notice patterns. Maybe most of your sources are Western or mostly senior scholars. That realization gives you a direction for improvement and also something to pay attention to. There are additional dimensions that we can consider. That includes LGBTQIA scholars, scholars with disability, non-English language scholarships, religious diversity, and other relevant identity categories that can be considered. Just remember that every discipline has its own citation culture and relevant categories. Adapt the form in order to reflect what matters most in your scholarly community while pursuing beyond traditional boundaries. Setting your citation goals. So, of course, as we said, every discipline is different. In literary studies, you might care about including post-colonial or queer perspectives. In education or psychology, you might want more work from practitioners of early career researchers. The key idea is customization. You can add categories that make sense for your field, like religious diversity, language of publication, or disability representation. What matters is that your citation practice reflects your scholarly values. So you need to ask yourself, what does inclusivity look like in my field? And then make that your standard. Once you know what to track, the next step, as you can see in this slide, is setting goals. You might choose a percentage goal, say half your sources authored by women, or a minimum number goal, maybe 3 or 4 works from underrepresented scholars. And sometimes you'll mark a category as not applicable, and that's okay too. The goal is intentionality, not obligation. This mindset shift from random citation to purposeful evaluation is enough. This can transform how literature review feels, reads, and even how it's received by editors and reviewers. Breaking the citation echo chamber. Now let's talk about a habit most of us have without realizing it. The citation echo chamber. You've seen it before, I'm sure. Everyone in your field keeps citing the same five or six papers. Why? Because we copy citation strings from other people's bibliographies without really thinking. This creates a closed loop. The same ideas, the same names, the same biases. To break this echo chamber, you have to read citations critically. Ask yourself, who's missing from this conversation? What newer work could enrich it? Which perspectives haven't been represented yet? This small act prevents your paper from just echoing what's out there, and it makes it part of living, evolving conversation. What's the problem with citation strings? Academic fields often develop these default citation patterns, and we need to be careful with that because it will perpetuate existing hierarchies. Uh, Making it harder for newer or marginalized scholars to gain recognition. We then need to break this pattern and conscious effort so that we can look beyond the usual suspects. Interestingly, many scholars have turned to social media to make citation more equitable. Platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn, and Mastodon have become spaces where researchers share work that deserves more visibility. For example, the hashtag cite her work encourages people to intentionally cite women whose research might otherwise be overlooked. It is not about tokenism, it's about visibility and recognition. It's a reminder that scholarly impact doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when others choose to include your work in the conversation. One of my favorite initiatives is from the literary scholar Coritha Michelle, who often posts, "Have you cited a woman of color today?" It's both a challenge and a gentle nudge. A reminder that diversity doesn't happen by accident, it happens by choice. And that choice to actively include underrepresented scholars doesn't just make your bibliography more inclusive, it makes your argument stronger because it incorporates a fuller spectrum of thought. So the next time you find an inspiring article or an undercited piece of research, share it, post it, mention it in your classes or presentations. That small act of amplification is part of what we call citation justice, creating pathways for great scholarship to be seen, cited, and even celebrated. Resources for diversifying your citations. Now you might be wondering, where do I even find diverse scholars to cite? Thankfully, you don't have to start from scratch. There are excellent curated resources designed exactly for this purpose. For instance, if you're working in Black feminist theory, the website blackfeminisms.com offers a comprehensive list of theorists and foundational writings. In other fields, similar databases exist, from disability studies to queer theory, from indigenous research to global education. And beyond websites, there's an even powerful resource, your academic work. So ask your colleagues, mentors, librarians. They often know specialized databases and hidden gems that generic search engines often overlook. Another good habit is to revisit your searches every few months. Databases are constantly updated, and even using a new keyword can reveal recent publications that completely change your perspectives. Think of these as building your scholarly ecosystem, an evolving network of voices that keep your work grounded, inclusive, and alive. Tracking your time. While we're expanding our bibliographies, we also have to manage something just as precious, our time. Refining your works cited and writing a thoughtful literature review isn't something you can do in a single marathon session. It takes consistency, small, daily engagements. A useful framework is this: 15 minutes a day keeps your project alive, 30 minutes creates real progress, an hour allows for deep revision, 2 hours or more builds mastery and momentum. Tracking your writing time, even in a simple log or a calendar, helps you stay accountable. You can use a writing app, a spreadsheet, or even just sticky notes on your desk. The point isn't to count minutes, it's to recognize patterns. When do you write best? Morning? Evening? Are you more focused after teaching or before? Once you know your rhythm, you can structure your week to protect that time, to make writing less about pressure and simply more about presence. That's why it's very important. Mark your progress daily. Let's pause for a moment to talk about something deceptively simple: tracking your progress. When you're working on a literature review or refining your works cited, consistency is everything. The truth is, writing doesn't move forward because of rare bursts of inspiration. It moves forward because of regular practice. That's why I always encourage you to mark your progress daily. Whether you use your digital calendar, a planner, or even a printed checklist, track every writing session. It could be 15 minutes, half an hour, or 2 hours. The length doesn't matter as much as the act of showing up. Every time you mark a check or log your time, you're reminding yourself, I'm still in motion. Even small sessions accumulate into major progress. And there's a psychological bonus. When you can see your progress, it builds momentum. It turns writing from something abstract and intimidating into something measurable and achievable. This daily accountability is like fitness training for the academic mind. You wouldn't expect to get fit by going to the gym once a month, right? So the same is true for writing. 15 minutes a day may not seem like much, but it keeps your ideas warm and your confidence strong. So let's look at identifying additional works. Ignore the days also, please. Now let's move to the focus of identifying additional works. At this stage, your goal is to discover any missing pieces in your literature. And this is where a lot of writers get stuck because they confuse being thorough with reading endlessly. There's a classic academic trap called the forest of no return. You start with one or two key sources, and suddenly every footnote opens up a new direction. Before you know it, you've gone so deep into the forest that you can't see the path back to your own argument. Sounds familiar? It happens to all of us. That's why this day is about striking a balance, being comprehensive, yet also focused. So you can read while writing and read then write. These techniques are effective. The trick is choosing the one that matches your writing style. So let's look at some of the methods to pay attention to. Method 1. Read while writing. If you tend to learn and think best through the act of writing, then this method is for you. Here's how it works. You start by reading one paragraph of your draft at a time. Then ask yourself a simple question. Does this paragraph actually need another citation? Not, could it use one? But does it truly need one? If the answer is yes, pause. Go find that one relevant source, skim it, and add it. Then keep moving forward. This approach keeps you grounded in your actual text. If it prevents you from wandering off into endless readings that may not even make it into your paper. You only look for what you need and when you need it. And it's incredibly efficient because it turns research into a responsive, living process rather than a separate, intimidating phase. Let's look at the second method, read, then write. On the other hand, if your article needs a major overhaul, if your topic has evolved or the other fields has shifted significantly, you may prefer the read then write method. This approach means taking a dedicated period to gather and review the latest scholarship before drafting. It's more structured, but also more time consuming. you'll likely end up with a stack of sources. So be realistic about what you truly can actually read. Plan to focus on a small list or around a dozen truly essential lists, not dozens or hundreds. And as you build this list, remember that breadth without depth won't help you. The goal is not to show that you've read everything, it's to demonstrate that you've read strategically and with purpose. Building your reading list. So, how do you find the best works to include? Start with people. Talk to colleagues, mentors, or anyone in your academic community. Ask, if you were writing on this topic, which articles or books would you consider indispensable? These personal recommendations often come with context. Why a work matters, how it influenced the field, what debates it shaped. That's knowledge you won't get from a database alone. And don't underestimate your librarians. They're trained to help researchers find exactly this kind of material and often know specialized databases or search tricks you haven't tried. We can begin also by searching strategically. When you use when you search online, be smart about it. Use precise, updated keywords that align closely with your argument, not just your general topic. If it's been more than 6 months since your last database search in the sciences or a year in the humanities, it's time for a refresh. New material is constantly being published, and keeping your review current is a small hallmark of scholarly rigor. Try checking multiple databases because no single one covers everything. For example, try JSTOR, Scopus, Google Scholar, Project Muse. Each index different journals. Cast a wide net, but filter carefully. Then you can draft your reading list. Once you've gathered your recommendations and search engines or search results, don't get bogged down in formatting. Your reading list at this stage is a working document, not your final bibliography. You can use tools like Mendeley and Zotero to save and organize articles. There's also a packet. But if that feels like overkill, a simple Word or Google Docs work perfectly. The goal isn't perfect organization, it's usability. A messy but functional list is infinitely better than a polished one you never touch. Stay alert or staying aligned with your citation values. As you build and revise your list, check back with your citation values goals. Ask yourself, does this list reflect the diversity and inclusion goals I set earlier in the week? If not, this is your chance to course correct. Add works by scholars who represent underrepresented voices, different geographies, or alternative methodologies, not to tick boxes, but to make sure your argument truly reflect the complexity in your field. We know your list ruthlessly. At some point, your list will grow too long, and that's when you have to winnow ruthlessly. Be honest with yourself. Which sources are directly relevant to your argument? Which are only tangentially related? If you're working with more than 24 sources, it's time to start cutting. Prioritize those that contribute something unique, a key argument, a foundational theory, or a recent data. Eliminate redundancy. If several sources make the same point, keep the strongest or the most recent. Remember, your goal isn't to prove you've read widely, it's to demonstrate that you've read wisely. Finalizing and prioritizing. When your list feels right, organize it by importance, not alphabetically. Start with the sources most central to your argument, then move outward. That way, if time runs short, you'll still have engaged with the material that matters most. As you read and skim, note down quick summaries, but also your reactions. Do I agree? Does this challenge my view? How might I use this in my argument? Those reflections are gold when you start writing your literature review. And finally, remind yourself you don't have to read everything deeply. For many sources, a careful skim is enough to understand the main argument, method, and implications. Full reading is for the works that directly shape your argument. This is where you need to skim efficiently. And when you say skim efficiently, we've built you at this point, you've already built your reading list, refined it, and prioritized it. Now comes the real challenge, actually getting through it. And this is where you have to learn to skim efficiently. Skimming doesn't mean careless reading. It means purposeful scanning. The goal is to read isn't to read every word, but it's to decide quickly whether a source is worth your deep attention. Here's how you do it. Start with the abstract or the introduction. This section tells you what the author is arguing and why it matters. Ask yourself, is this argument relevant to my topic? Does it speak to my research question or theoretical framework? If the answer is no, move on. If yes, keep going. Next, scan the section headings. These give you the architecture of your article, how the author builds their argument, what subtopics they explore, and where you might find useful connections. Then jump to the conclusion. This is where the author tells you what all the data or analysis was really about. By reading the ending early, you can see whether the work offers insights that truly support or challenge your own. Finally, make a decision. Will you read these in full or is it not essential? And if you're unsure, give yourself a time limit, 15 minutes per article maximum. That way, you avoid falling back into the forest of no return. Efficient skimming keeps your workload realistic and your focus sharp. Remember, the goal isn't to read everything, it's to identify what's worth reading deeply. Get copies of essential sources. Once you've finished your skimming phase and identified which materials will genuinely strengthen your article, it's time to secure full copies of those works. Download the PDF, borrow the book, or scan the chapters you need. But be thorough. Make sure every file you have includes the copyright page or the publication information. You'll thank yourself later when you're finalizing citations. There's nothing worse than realizing weeks later that you don't have the full bibliographic details and then scrambling to find them again. So, as a rule, if you're copying or scanning, include the title page, the copyright page, and any DOI or publication details. That way, your reference list stays accurate and ready to go. Start reading with purpose. Now, when you sit down to read those full texts, approach them with purpose. Don't just summarize, don't just underline sentences. Instead, analyze. Write in complete sentences, even short ones, about what each text does. For example, this article argues that, or the author supports this view by, or a weakness of this argument is. When you write this way, you're training yourself to think critically, not just absorb information. You're moving from note taking to evaluation. These short analytical sentences will become the building blocks of your literature, which will matter in the future. They're how you'll explain relationships among scholars, who agrees, who disagrees, who builds upon whom. And it's the difference between listing sources and engaging with them. But as you read, keep winnowing. As you read, keep refining your list. If a source turns out to be less relevant than you thought, you'd feel guilty about setting it aside. Stopping is not failure, it's focus. Make a brief note of your list about why you stopped reading, something like too theoretical, or covers a different period, or already handled by Smith. These notes are small acts of memory. They help future you avoid second guessing decisions later. This process of constant refinement keeps your workload manageable and your literature review strong. So you'll finish with a concise, purposeful set of readings that directly serve your argument, not just fill pages. Don't panic about extra time. Don't panic about extra time. What do we mean by that? Don't panic. So let's be honest. Sometimes this phase takes longer than expected. You might discover more sources than you planned. You might need extra days to finish reading or thinking. That's completely normal. Research doesn't always follow a strict schedule, and good scholarship often requires patience. The key is to keep moving forward. Even slow progress is still progress, as long as you're engaging meaningfully with your sources, evaluating, reflecting, refining. You're right on track. Remember, slow and steady still wins. Slow and steady still wins the race to publication. Which leads you to identifying your entry point. Ignore the day, no? Uh, Now that you've gathered and refined your sources, it's time to take the next big step, identifying your entry point. The precise place where your work joins the scholarly conversation. Think of it in this way. Every research field is a conversation that's been happening long before you entered it. Scholars are debating, challenging, and building on or revising each other's ideas. Your entry point is the moment you pull up a chair to that table and say, here's where I fit in. Finding that point isn't always easy, but it's one of the most important intellectual tasks you'll do. Why does your entry point matter? Your entry point shows your reader why your work matters. Sorry. Um, we'll look at this one in a bit. Um, so, it is the entry point is how you make your contributions visible. Without it, your literature review risks sounding like a summary. But with a clear entry point, you turn your review into an argument, one that says, here's what others have done, here's what's missing, here's where my work steps in. The easiest way to begin is by asking a few of these simple, powerful questions. What relationship exists among the scholars I've read? Are they responding to each other, debating the same issues, or maybe talking past each other entirely? Or how are these writers justifying the argument? Are they claiming novelty, challenging tradition, building on a shared foundation, and the like? That is why it's very important to actually build your entry point, no? Uh, because that will tell you what are the things we want to consider, no? What are the things we need to build on, no? Which leads us to the power of conversation. Uh, let's build. So the power of conversation is at the heart of scholarship. Every piece of academic writing, no matter how specialized or technical, is part of a larger conversation. When you cite, when you analyze, when you respond, you're talking to other thinkers. You're joining an ongoing dialogue that stretches across time, geography, and disciplines. And that's what makes scholarship exciting. You're not writing in isolation, you're participating. You're saying, I've listened carefully to what's been said before me, and here's how I want to respond. This is why citation isn't just about giving credit, it's about showing readers who you are in conversation with, whose ideas shaped yours, whose work you are extending, and whose assumptions you might be challenging. Here are key questions for finding your entry point. So, key questions for finding your entry point. Now that we've explored the power of conversation, let's ground the idea in something practical. How do you actually find your entry point? Or what questions can guide you towards the moment of clarity, where your voice joins the scholarly dialogue with purpose? Let's go through a few questions and you can use which you can use as intellectual tools. Think of them as your compass, questions that orient you while you navigate the sea of existing research. First, what's the central conversation in my field? Start broad, step back, and look at the big picture. What are people debating? What's the hot topic, the recurring issue, or the unresolved tension that keeps showing up in articles, conferences, and discussions? Understanding that central conversation helps you situate yourself. If you can describe the main question in your field, even in one sentence, you already have a map where your work fits. For example, in education studies, the big question might be, how do we measure learning beyond standardizing tests? In media studies, it might be about the question of technology. How is digital technology reshaping identity? Once you name the larger question, you can see how your project connects to it, whether you're extending, challenging, or complicating. Second question, locate the intersection points. Ask yourself, what part of that big conversation does my research touch most directly? Maybe you're focusing on a smaller community, a neglected theory, or a case that hasn't been studied before, or maybe you're revisiting a well known question with a new method or a new angle. That intersection, that overlap between your interests and the field's main conversation is where your argument begins to take shape. Or what do I offer that's not distinct, that is the heart of it? Ask yourself, what am I contributing that others haven't? Now, don't panic. This doesn't have to be earth shattering. You're not required to revolutionize your discipline. Your contribution might be as simple as adding context, nuance, or a new application of an old idea. Maybe you're asking a familiar question in an unfamiliar setting. Maybe you're comparing two frameworks that haven't been compared before. Maybe you're surfacing voices that have been excluded from the discussion. Distinctiveness isn't about magnitude, it's about clarity. It's about knowing what makes your perspective worth hearing in this ongoing scholarly conversation. Next, gaps. Uh, gaps. We need to look at gaps. Every field has unanswered questions. Gaps where the evidence is thin or the assumption that go unchallenged. Look for patterns. What's missing in existing research? What contradictions do you see in the literature? Where do scholars seem to agree too easily? Maybe without enough justification. When you identify those gaps or tension, you find your leverage point. Your work becomes the bridge that connects those loose ends, the piece that helps move the discussion forward. You also need to ask, who am I in conversation with and why? This is where your citations come alive. Instead of thinking of them as a list of required references, think of them as voices you've chosen to engage with. Ask yourself, who's the main thinker I'm responding to, and why those specific people? Once you can articulate why you're citing someone, your writing becomes intentional. Your citation uh, becomes important. Then why does my work at the reader's understanding shift the focus outward? Instead of asking what your research does for you, ask what it does to your reader. When someone finishes your article, what should they walk away understanding that they didn't before? A new perspective, a missing link, a clearer framework? When you can answer that question, you know your purpose. And once your purpose is clear, the structure of your paper, from the introduction to the conclusion, practically writes itself. So now that you've cited or now that you've clarified your entry points, let's talk about a practical and honestly transformative next step: grouping texts by argument. This is where your literature review stops being a list of sources and starts becoming a genuine conversation. See, many writers make the mistake of organizing their literature review chronologically by date or alphabetically by author. That's the easiest way to stay organized. But it's also the fastest way to make your readers feel lost. Because time and names don't explain ideas. Instead, what you want to do is group your readings by argument, by what each source says and how it relates to your own research. Think of your literature review as hosting a roundtable discussion. If you just call on people one by one, it feels random. But if you seat people based on what they're saying, who agrees, who disagrees, who build on whom, you create structure. That's what grouping by argument does. It lets your readers see the intellectual map, which ideas dominate the field, which debates are still unresolved, and where your work fits in between them. You're not just summarizing, you're synthesizing knowledge. And that's very important. And that's something you have to pay attention to. All right. So now that we've explored how to group text by argument and identify relationships between scholars, let's take that one further step. We're going to talk about something incredibly important: common entry point patterns. This slide helps you name the different ways you can enter a scholarly conversation, because once you recognize your pattern, you can describe your contribution with confidence and clarity. Let's go through each one together. One, filling a gap. This is probably the most familiar type of entry point: filling a gap. You've looked at the existing literature and realized that something's missing. Maybe no one has studied a particular text, community, or time period. Maybe there's an assumption that hasn't been tested or a method that hasn't been applied. When you fill a gap, you're saying this area has been overlooked and my work addresses that omission. But here's the key. Don't just say, there's a gap in the literature and every field has gaps. Instead, explain why this specific gap matters. What we learn when that missing piece is finally put in place. So, you might say, while earlier studies focus on national policies, few have examined how these play out in rural school. This study fills that gap by that. That's a clear, confident way of marking your contribution. Second, resolving a debate. The second pattern is resolving a debate. This is when scholars disagree about how to interpret something and you step in to help clarify or move the argument forward. You might notice, for example, that two camps are using the same data but drawing very different conclusions. Your research could offer new evidence or a new framework that reconciles their differences. In this case, your entry point sounds like scholars remain divided on whether X causes Y or the reverse. My finding suggests a more complex relationship that accounts for both factors. Here's here your work becomes a bridge. It provides resolution to the issue, or at least advances the debate to a more productive stage. Third, bridging conversations. Next is one of my personal favorites. Build bridging conversations. This is when you realize that two groups of scholars are talking about similar things, but not to each other. Maybe gender studies and environmental sociology are exploring parallel questions about care and sustainability, but they're doing it in different vocabularies. Your role might be to bridge them together, to build the bridge that allows each side to inform the other. For example, while scholars in education discuss empathy as a pedagogical tool, scholars in psychology explores it as a cognitive process. My research connects these two strands to show how emotional understanding develops in classroom settings. See how that creates dialogue where none existed before. That's real intellectual contribution. Next, challenging assumption. That's the fourth pattern. This is for those moments when you realize that an entire field has been taking something for granted, an idea, a category, or even a method, and your research shows why it might not hold up. This is the bold move. It's not about tearing things down for the sake of it, but about re examining what everyone knows to be true. So you might say most studies assume the economic growth automatically improves well being. I challenge that assumption by showing how. Challenging assumptions doesn't mean being contrarian. It means deepening the conversation by questioning the foundation on which it rests. So those are the four major entry point patterns we see most often: filling a gap, resolving a debate, bridging conversations, challenging assumptions. Each one represents a legitimate and valuable way to contribute to your field. The point isn't to choose the right one. It's to recognize which pattern fits your work, and then articulate it clearly. So when you say, I'm bridging two conversations, or I'm filling a gap that's been overlooked, you immediately sound grounded, strategic, and intentional. And editors and reviewers notice that. Now, of course, there are uh there aren't the only ways to enter a conversation. Sometimes your work doesn't fill a gap or resolve a debate. It might offer a new lens or add nuance to what's already there. That's what we'll explore next. More entry points. All right. Now that we've covered the first four major ways scholars typically enter a conversation, filling a gap, resolving a debate, bridging conversation, and challenging assumptions, let's talk about a few more subtle but equally powerful entry points. Sometimes your work isn't about fixing or feeling anything. It's about offering a different way of seeing, like introducing a new lens or method. The first of these additional patterns is that this happens when you take an existing body of research and approach it from a completely new angle. Maybe through a different theoretical framework or using a new methodology that others haven't tried. For instance, imagine most scholars are studying social media literacy using surveys and quantitative data. You might come in and say, let's explore this phenomenon through ethnographic storytelling or discourse analysis. By doing that, you're not disputing the existing research. You're enriching it with a new perspective and a new set of tools. Or maybe your lens isn't methodological, but theoretical. Perhaps you apply feminist theory to a body of work that always been studied through economic models. That shift, that or reorientation becomes your entry point. So instead of saying I disagree, or you're saying I'm looking differently. And that's a powerful, creative way to contribute to your field. The second additional pattern is adding nuance or complexity. This is for those moments when the existing conversation isn't wrong. It's just too simple. Maybe scholars have been treating a concept as black and white, and your work reveals the gray areas in between. You might show how a theory that works well in one context doesn't hold up as neatly in another. For example, you might say, while previous research has portrayed digital activism as universally empowering, my findings suggest it's far more context dependent. See how that doesn't reject the existing conversation, it complicates it, it deepens it. It says, this is still true, but there's some more story to it. Adding nuance is one of the most sophisticated entry points you can take because it demonstrates that you understand the field deeply enough to see its limitations. You're not standing outside it, you're working within it to make it richer. Now, some of you might be thinking, But what if my project doesn't fit neatly into just one of these categories? That's okay. And that's normal. Most strong research projects blend patterns. And you might start by filling a gap and end up challenging an assumption. Or you might bridge conversations using a new lens. The point isn't to label your work, it's to help you talk about it clearly. Because when you can describe how your research enters the conversation, you show that you know exactly where you stand. And that confidence translates into stronger writing and better feedback. So now we've looked at 6 different entry point patterns: filling a gap, resolving a debate, bridging conversations, challenging assumptions, introducing a new lens or method, adding nuance or complexity. Each one represent a way of saying, here's how my work belongs in this field. Now the question becomes, how do you decide which one best fits your project? Or how do you take all of these and translate it into clear, confident statement of contribution? That's where you make your entry point decisions. Now that we've explored the different types of entry points, from filling a gap to adding a nuance, it's time to make a decision. This is where reflection becomes action. You've gathered your readings, analyzed your arguments, and recognized the main conversations in your field. Now you need to decide where you'll enter. And I want to start by saying this clearly. Your decision doesn't have to be perfect right away. It just has to be intentional. Step 1, identify the pattern that feels most natural. Ask yourself, which entry point best describes what I'm already doing? Maybe you realize that your project naturally fills a gap because no one has studied your specific case or text before. Or perhaps you're challenging an assumption, showing that a widely accepted idea doesn't hold true in your data. You don't have to force your research into a pattern. Instead, listen to your writing. What's the main move you're already making? That's your entry point. Step 2, write a draft statement. Once you've identified your likely point, try expressing it in one clear statement. It doesn't have to be formal. Think of it as a working sentence that clarifies your role. Here's a simple formula. While previous research has focused on X, few studies have examined Y. My project addresses these by Z, showing that your key insight. So let's test that with an example. If you're studying representations of climate anxiety in young adult fiction, you might say, while most studies of climate fiction analyze adult novels, few have examined how environmental themes are explored in young adult literature. My study fills this gap by analyzing how adolescent protagonists negotiate hope and despair in the face of ecological crisis. Let's look at the pattern again. My previous research has focused on what others have done. Few studies have examined your specific focus. My project addresses this by your contribution or perspective, showing that your key insight. That's it. Clear, specific, and grounded in a recognizable entry point. Once you've drafted your early entry point statement, check it against your materials. Does my evidence actually support this claim? Sometimes we want to be doing one thing like resolving a debate, but our data or reading actually showing something else. That's okay. Adjust your entry point so it reflects what your research actually demonstrates, not just what you hope it would. Remember, your entry point should grow naturally out of your research, not be imposed into it. Step 4, keep it flexible. Your entry point isn't set in stone. It can and often will evolve as you continue reading and writing. Maybe your initial gap filling project becomes a new lens. That's part of the process. Think of your entry point as a draft map, something you refine as you understand your terrain better. Why does this decision matter? Making this decision gives your paper direction. It tells you what to emphasize in your literature review, what to highlight in your introduction, and what kind of claims to foreground in your conclusion. Without a clear entry point, your writing risks drifting. It becomes a series of summaries instead of a coherent argument. But once you know your entry point, everything else aligns. Your structure, your tone, even your transitions. It's like tuning an instrument. Suddenly, everything harmonizes. So, to recap, making an entry point decision means choosing how you'll join the scholarly conversation. And it's not just what you'll write about, but how you'll contribute. Once that's clear, you're ready to take the next big step, turning all this research, reflection, and decision making into writing. That's why we go to writing your literature review. Now that you've chosen your entry point, the way you project your project joins the conversation, it's time to turn that insight into writing. This is where all your preparation begins to pay off, writing your literature review. A literature review isn't just a list of everything that's been written on the topic. It's your opportunity to tell the story of the conversation. It shows your reader how the field got to this point and where your work fits into the trajectory. So, how do we do that? Use the literature. Don't let it use you. No, use the literature. Don't let it use you. What does that mean? It means the literature should serve your argument, not overwhelm it. Your review shouldn't feel like a long parade of other people's ideas. It should feel like you're leading your reader through a carefully chosen conversation. You're the guide. You decide which voices to bring forward, which arguments to emphasize, and how each one connects to your thesis. The literature supports you. It doesn't speak for you. Next, organize your review by ideas or arguments, not by individual authors. A common mistake is to write one paragraph per author. Smith argues this, Jones disagrees, Lee proposes that. That structure feels safe, but it's not analysis, it's summary. Instead, group your paragraphs by themes, by tensions, by perspectives. For example, one section might explore how scholars define your key concept. Another might focus on methods or evidence. A third might discuss disagreements or emerging trends. When you group by argument, you show synthesis. You're making sense of the conversation rather than just reporting it. Next, I'll skip. Write clear transitions. Transitions are the invisible glue that holds your review together. They show your reader how each part connects logically to the next. So use phrases like building on this foundation, or in contrast to this perspective, or while the studies agree that they differ on. Notice how each one establishes a relationship between ideas, agreement, contrast, or development. These small signals keep your writing cohesive and your reader oriented. Balance summary and analysis. A good literature review finds the right balance between summarizing what others have said and analyzing what that means for your project. Summary says what each scholars argues. Analysis explain why it matters. So instead of stopping at Lopez 2020 argues that digital participation empowers marginalized voices, add a layer of interpretation. Lopez's findings suggest that empowerment is mediated by access, a theme that recurs across recent digital culture studies. That's analysis. And it's what transforms your review from informative to insightful. So there's a very huge difference between summary and analysis, as we've said. Next, make your voice audible. Even though this section is about other people's work, your voice should still be the strongest one in the room. How? By continually tying each point back to the argument. Don't let readers forget why these sources matter. Using guiding phrases like, for my purposes, in this study I build on, or this argument provides the foundation for my analysis of. These small reminders keep your voice present and your review purposeful. Finally, I'll talk about this in a bit. Finally, conclude with your literature review. By returning to your entry point, you've shown your readers the landscape. Now mark your map on the map. Briefly state how your work contributes to the conversation. That one sentence does a lot. It clarifies your contribution and sets up the rest of your paper. Now that we've talked about how to structure your literature review, let's spend a few minutes on what not to do, the common pitfalls that weaken even the most well-researched papers. Knowing these mistakes ahead of time helps you recognize them before they creep into your draft. So as we go through this, think about which ones you might need to watch out in your own writing. 1. The laundry list review. The first and most common pitfall is what I call the laundry list review. This is when your literature review becomes a list, one author after another, one summary after the next, without any real synthesis or connection between them. It sounds something like Smith argues that, Joyce disagrees, Lee says something similar, and then nothing ties it together. Note, the problem here isn't that you've missed information. It's that the reader can't see the conversation. It's like watching a movie made up of unrelated clips. Technically, everything's there, but it doesn't tell a story. To fix this, always ask yourself, what's the relationship between these ideas? Or why am I putting these colors next to each other? That's what turns a list into a dialogue. Second, the everything I've read problem. The second pitfall is trying to include everything you've ever read. I know why it happens. You've done so much work, you want to show it all. But remember, the goal of your literature review isn't to prove how many articles you've read. It's to show that you understand the shape of the conversation. Too much information overwhelms your readers and buries your argument. Be selective. Choose the sources that best represent the key debates, developments, and perspectives you are engaging with. A focused, well-chosen review demonstrates maturity, confidence, and it says, I know what matters most. Third, the no entry point problem. The third pitfall is the missing entry point. When your review summarizes everyone else's work but never shows where you come in. This happens when writers forget to connect the literature back to the research question or purpose. So you end up with pages of other people's arguments, but your reader can't tell, why is this relevant? Where does this writer stand? What's new here? To avoid this, keep your entry point visible throughout your review. Use transitional sentences that remind the reader. For my study, this raises the question of, or this perspective provides the framework of my analysis of. Your voice should guide the reader through, even as you're discussing others' ideas. Fourth, the overly defensive stance. Another common trap is being too defensive, writing as if you have to justify every choice or prove that senior scholars are wrong. Remember, disagreement is healthy, but tone matters. You're not attacking the field, you're advancing it. So instead, say, previous scholars failed to recognize, instead of saying that, say, building on earlier work, this study extends the conversation by. That phrasing shows respect for the predecessors while still asserting your contribution. It keeps your tone collegial and your argument persuasive. Now that we've discussed the common pitfalls, the next step is to cite with precision. How to cite with precision. Because even if your argument is strong, sloppy or inconsistent citation can undermine your credibility. And we definitely don't want that. So let's look at some strategies for doing it well. All right. Now that we've talked about what not to do, let's get a little more practical and focus on one of the most essential skills of academic writing, citing with precision. Because citation isn't just a technical task, it's rhetorical. It's how you signal authority, context, and respect for your intellectual community. So when you cite precisely, you're not only giving credit, you're showing your reader exactly how each source functions in your argument. So there are three ways to do that. Cite for evidence, cite for theory, and cite for debate. When you bring a source into writing, just don't just drop it in. Show your reader how it relates to your point. Another sign of precision is integration. Avoid the temptation to stack multiple citations like a pile of bricks. Sure, you've cited everyone there, but we can't tell what each one adds. Instead, weave your sources in throughout your paragraph. That way, your citation becomes alive and they're part of the conversation, not what we call footnote clatter. Third, be clear about who's saying what. This might sound obvious, but it's surprisingly easy to blur voices in academic writing. When you summarize several scholars at once, make sure your reader always know whose ideas they are reading. That small clarification keeps your argument distinct from your sources. Your readers always know which voice is speaking, theirs or yours. Another one also is vary your citation moves. Precision always comes with variety. Using citations in different rhetorical ways depending on purpose. Sometimes you'll support a point, Other times you'll extend the point, or you might challenge a point. Notice how each version uses the same source but differently. That's what precise citation does. It adapts to your rhetorical move. Lastly, the precision means citing the right source for the right reason. If you're referencing a scholar specific findings, cite the original study, not a secondary source that mentions it. If you're referring to a concept that evolved over time, cite the version that best fits your argument. And whenever possible, go to the primary source. Not only does that strengthen your credibility, it also ensures you're representing the idea accurately. Precise citation might feel small, but it's the difference between writing that feels confident and writing that feels uncertain. Readers can tell when you're in control of your sources, when you are the one guiding the conversation, instead of letting it overwhelm you. Good citation builds trust. It tells your readers, I know where these ideas come from, I understand them, and here's how they matter. That's scholarly integrity in action. Now, of course, sometimes our effort to cite sources backfires. And we end up most of the time with what we call citation strings. Be careful with that. Be careful with that. A long, tangled line of names doesn't actually help the reader at all. So, we've talked about how to cite precisely and how to avoid turning your literature review into a dense, disconnected block of text. Now let's talk about how to integrate your literature material into the rest of your paper. Because strong academic writing doesn't treat your literature review as one-time section you get out of the way. It's a chore. It's a tool, something that should appear throughout your writing in ways that guide and strengthen your argument. So there are four sections here to consider, uh, and let's talk about this one. So first, your literature review shouldn't live only in one section, as you can see. Yes, there's usually a dedicated review portion near the beginning, but remember your engagement with other scholars doesn't stop there. Bring your sources back into latter sections of your paper. So when you describe your methods, connect them to established approaches in the field. When you discuss your results, link them back to what previous researchers found. When you write your conclusion, revisit keywords to show how you findings contribute to or complicate the existing conversation. This ongoing integration reminds your reader that your work is part of a continuous dialogue. Sometimes integration means using previous research to set the stage for your argument. Integration works best when it feels seamless, not like a drop-in citation, but like a thought that flows organically into yours. When you present findings or analysis, reference the literature as a frame, a way of showing how your work engages existing ideas. This approach, so you're not just citing for the sake of it, you're using prior research to highlight your interpretation. This approach keeps your readers oriented and demonstrates that your analysis grows directly out of the scholarly conversation. One of the most effective integration strategies is to bring literature in dialogue with your own findings. When you do that, you demonstrate synthesis. You're not just reporting results, you're positioning them in a scholarly ecosystem. Integration can also happen between sections, especially when you use sources to create continuity from one part of the paper to the next. That here we see how good writing doesn't isolate its components but connects them. And through all these, remember, your voice should always remain the anchor. Your voice should always remain the anchor. What does that mean? Integrating literature does mean giving up control on your narrative. It means showing um, how your voice engages with others. Sometimes agreeing, sometimes challenging, sometimes extending. That sentence shows synthesis, confidence, and flow, the hallmarks of effective integration. So, how long should a literature review be? And the answer, as you might expect, is it depends. It depends on your purpose. It depends on your it depends on your discipline, on the project's overall length. But more importantly, it depends on how effectively your review supports your argument. So rather than thinking in terms of page count, I want you to think in terms of proportion and purpose. That's enough. So your literature review should be proportional to the size and scope of your overall project. And a common mistake is assuming that a longer literature review means a stronger one. That's actually not true. Uh, your literature review should go deep rather than wide. It's better to engage 5 or 6 key sources deeply than to skim 20 superficially. Depth shows understanding. Breadth without analysis just shows that you've been busy. Readers, especially in the academic setting, want to see evidence of synthesis, that you've thought about how ideas connect, not simply what they say. Next, get feedback. When you finish writing, ask a friend to read it. And whether you've been clear about the scholarly debate, the main positions, your specific entry point, and how your arguments differ or builds on. You can also leave questions for your readers, whether they're able to summarize the scholarly debate you're engaging in, the literature, the work, the question you're filling in, or maybe you've spent too much time summarizing sources and things like that. So then you can evaluate your week's progress. whether what did you accomplish, what challenged you, and how was your writing. It's also important to take note of patterns, procrastination patterns, the things you tried to delay, perfectionism patterns, your what you want to get perfect, the research spiral patterns, and the interruption patterns. But don't forget also to celebrate your accomplishments. Week 3, no? Week 3. I mean, take pride if you've been moving forward. You've engaged deeply with citation values, assessed your relationship to existing scholarship, possibly read and integrated new sources, identified your entry point, and written or revised your literature review. This is substantial and sophisticated intellectual work. So, sorry, what are your key takeaways from this week? First, um, your argument organizes the literature review, not the other way around. Second, methods. Read while writing or read then write. Choose the approach that works for you. Third, 12 manageables goal. Aim for about 12 sources in your final reading list. And 20% proportion. Literature review should be roughly 20 to 25% of total article length. So the work you've done this week creates the foundation for the rest of your article revision. A strong literature review that clearly positions your contribution makes every other section easier to write. Looking ahead, with your literature review solid, you can now sharpen your introduction, knowing exactly what scholarly conversation you're joining. Strengthen your method section by citing appropriate precedents and developing your analysis in dialogue with existing literature scholarship. Also, by writing a conclusion that clearly articulates your contribution. There are certain resources for ongoing citation practice. Take note, discipline-specific lists, social media communities, and citation tools. Now, maybe it's also important to look at why this matters, right? The bigger picture. Why this matters? Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Everything we've talked about this week, from citation precision to entry points and literature review strategy, connects to something much larger than just writing a better paper. This work extends far beyond your individual article. By engaging thoughtfully with how we cite, how we review, and how we position our voices, you're actually participating in a collective project of reshaping what knowledge looks like. When you write a literature review, you're not just mapping ideas, you're helping define whose ideas count. Every citation you include is a small but powerful act of recognition. You're actually saying, this voice belongs in the conversation, or you're helping decide who gets remembered, whose ideas get built upon, and whose work becomes invisible. That's why citation is never neutral. It's cultural, it's historical, and it's ethical. It reflects what we value and sometimes what we've overlooked. When you cite diverse scholars, when you intentionally include women, scholars by color, researchers from the global south, us, this you're helping correct centuries of exclusion in academic knowledge. You're saying that expertise doesn't come from one kind of person, one kind of institution, or another corner of the world. This doesn't mean citing just to be symbolic. It means citing thoughtfully, recognizing when perspectives from outside the dominant tradition can deepen or challenge your own understanding. That's how we make conversation richer and inclusive. Academia, like any system, has habits, and citation patterns are one of them. Certain names get repeated and recycled, others fade into the background, even when their contributions were foundational. When you notice these patterns, question them. You're not being rebellious, you're being responsible. Think about your literature review, not just as a technical task, but as an act of inclusion. So, yes, the work of this week, refining citations, grouping arguments, crafting your entry point, it makes your writing stronger, your thinking clearer, and your scholarship more persuasive. But on a deeper level, it also makes the academy itself more equitable, more intellectually honest, and more alive. Every time you cite with awareness, every time you challenge inherited assumption, every time you make your literature review a space for multiple voices, you're actually helping a version of academia that reflects the diversity and complexity of the real world. That's what this is really about. So as you move forward into your draft, remember that your bibliography isn't just a list. It's a portrait of your values. It shows you who you've listened to, who you've learned from, and who you've chosen to bring with you into the future of your field. That's the bigger picture, and that's what makes this work matters. So, this is your week checklist. Ignore the week again. Citation assessment, entry point clarity, feedback obtained, additional reading, literature review, time tracked. You've completed, in fact. So as you move forward, pay attention how you have completed this one. Okay? Uh, moving forward with confidence. This is actually the next phase. It looks easy, but it isn't. You know? Take a deep breath. You've made it through one of the most intellectually demanding weeks. It's actually the third week. So it's really one of the most demanding weeks, as you'd notice. This is just your second lecture and two more. Huh? Uh, this week asked a lot of you to think critically, to write reflectively, and to locate your own voice within a much larger conversation. And that's not easy work. But look at where you are now. You've clarified your entry point, refined your understanding of the field, and strengthened your ability to write with precision and purpose. That's an incredible accomplishment. First, recognize what you've built. The clarity you've gained about your relationship to existing scholarship and about your specific contribution, that's going to carry you forward through the next stages of revision. You've moved from simply reporting what others have said to actively participating in how the field thinks and grows. And that's a shift from summary to conversation. So take a moment to acknowledge that growth. You're not just writing an article anymore. You're joining and shaping a scholarly conversation that's powerful work. And you're doing it with care, with precision, and with integrity. Second, the literature review as invitation. Remember, your literature review isn't just a required section, it's your invitation to readers. It's how you say, here's the world I'm entering. Here are the thinkers who've guided me. Here's how my voice adds something meaningful to theirs. That's what makes a great review. Not the number of sources, but the depth of connection. You've crafted the invitation thoughtfully and deliberately. You've shown that you know how to enter a conversation with confidence and respect. And as we step forward to the next lecture, I want you to carry that momentum with you. You've laid the intellectual groundwork, you've located your entry point, you've refined your citations and arguments, you've practiced writing as an act of synthesis and inclusion. Now, the challenge ahead is to keep that energy alive in the revision. When you hit a tough paragraph, when the words won't flow or your argument feels tangled, remind yourself, I'm almost there. You've clarified your why. You've built the foundation of a meaningful, ethical, and persuasive piece of scholarship. Now it's about continuing that clarity through the next stages of the process. So, before you close your notes, pause. Take a moment to really recognize how far we've come. You've learned to think like a researcher, to write like a scholar. And that's not just technical progress, it's creative and moral progress too. Every line you've written moves you closer to becoming the kind of scholar who not only joins the conversation, but helps reshape it, making it more thoughtful, more inclusive, and more aligned. You've earned that confidence. So as we move forward, remember this. You're not refining a works cited page. You're refining your relationship to knowledge itself. That's what scholars do. That's what you are doing. And yes, you're doing it beautifully. I'll see you in the next pre recorded lecture. Thank you very much for bearing with me.